Good morning. I'm on a little bit early today. I've got somebody going to be making a delivery here pretty quick. And today we're going to look at all of Matthew 14. Combines today and tomorrow's readings. Tomorrow morning, Sunday, we'll have worship at 9 o'clock at Mabel in Sutton. You're welcome to join us live, or if you choose, in person as well. Today, chapter 14 has the death of John the Baptist. Back in Matthew 4, as Jesus had returned from being in the wilderness for the 40 days of temptation, one of the first things he is informed of that John has been arrested. And so and we know that John was in prison for a while because he sent people to ask. Last Sunday's gospel reading, from John, John the Baptist, from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, we had seen, John the Baptist pointing Jesus out and a couple of his disciples following him, and the come and see invitation. So today, we're now told of John's death, of how it happens. And again, it's a story that we're familiar with, that, Herod has had John arrested because John was a person who followed the law, and he told Herod that, for Herod to marry his brother's wife was against the law. It was, that wasn't the way you should be doing things. But, Herod was the king and thought, well, he can do what he wanted. So he was upset with John for, pointing out his sin. And we know that, people still get bent out of shape when they're told that what they're doing is wrong. But anyway, Herod was, it says that he was afraid of the people, that if he put John to death, that there would be an uprising because there were so many that were following and listening to John. And, with his call of, come, repent, be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, John was popular with the people. But Herod's wife, his brother's wife, who was now his wife, didn't like it that John would dare to say that the king was sinning. What he was doing was wrong. And upon Herod's birthday, we know the story of how John then was put to death. And it says, verse 12, his disciples came and took the body and buried it. And then they told Jesus. And so again, another sad time for Jesus. And right after that, the verse says that Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there to a boat, to a deserted place by himself. And, so often when we hurt, when we hear this, some bad news, or, when a loved one of ours passes away, we need some of that alone time. And it's good to have some of that alone time. But it's also good to have people gather around us. And this is what happened, for Jesus. When the crowds heard where he went, they followed him. And when he came to shore, he saw these great crowds. But, the thing with these crowds is that they weren't there to console Jesus. They weren't there to encourage Jesus and to remind him of the promises of God, and that they were there looking for a handout again. They were there because Jesus had been curing and healing and teaching and doing all of this good. And they came, and this was what was on their minds, their needs. And Jesus saw them, it says, and he took compassion on them. And that is such an important word, such an important thing, that Jesus took compassion on these people. In the midst of his pain and sorrow and his sense of loss for John, he still was filled with compassion for others. And that's one of the reasons that we gather around families and others gather around us, at times when a loved one passes away. It's because of the compassion. It's because that, we're moved within our spirits, to see the needs of others. And that's what compassion is. Compassion isn't just love, but Compassion is a feeling of caring, of desire to help and to make things better for others. So Jesus had compassion, and he healed and he cured them. And when it was evening, his disciples came and says, this is a deserted place. There's no place to get food. And there's a bunch of people, they're hungry. And Jesus says to them, you give them something to eat. The disciples wanted Jesus to tell the people, go home. And it was a huge crowd, as we find out, because this is the feeding of the 5,000 men besides women and children, is what it says in verse 21. So you think about that. It wasn't just 5,000 people, but 5,000 men plus the women and children. So many, many more than just 5,000. And when Jesus said to these disciples, you give them something to eat, think of their first reaction. What and how? And they say, we've got nothing here but 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that this little boy has. Poor boy's lunch. And they weren't big fish. They were most likely little bitty fish. These 5 fish probably would have been enough to fill those 2 buns with some meat for a fish sandwich. But Jesus tells the disciples, take this food and divide it among the people. And there's enough for everybody. And people will wonder, how big is God's love? It's pretty big. You think about that Jesus could make these 2 little sandwiches enough to feed, say, 10,000 people. If there was one woman and, not even one woman and 1 child for every man there. That'd be 15,000 people. But, Jesus, because of his love, because of his compassion for these people, the enormous amount that is there. And this is just, one way that we can kind of measure or get an idea of the love that God has and the abilities that God has. If I had 2 little sandwiches to share between a bunch of people, I could slice it pretty skinny, but I'm pretty sure that not everybody would get some, and there wouldn't be any leftovers. But there were leftovers. It says 12 baskets full. There was more left over than he had to start with. And just another one of those examples for us of the abundance of God's grace, of God's love, of God's mercy. And right after they got done feeding these people, Jesus tells his disciples to get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus goes off by himself up on the mountain to pray. This is just after he's heard of John's death. This is, that very same night, later that day, that Jesus again is going to find some alone time, some reflection time, some time with his Father, God. And he spends some time up on the mountains praying. And then it says, when evening came, he was there by himself, but the boat was battered by the waves and by the wind and far out from land. And then early in the morning, Jesus comes to them. So it was evening when Jesus was there. And it was still, late evening when this boat began to be bombarded with waves and the wind and the terror that the disciples were feeling. And it was early in the morning when Jesus came. He didn't come immediately. He wasn't there the very second that the waves came. He wasn't there the very second that the first wave crashed over the bow of the boat and they had to start bailing and fearing for their lives because the storms could come so quickly. And that again too is very much like our life. Storms can come quickly. Life can be going along pretty good. And then boom, something happens. We have a diagnosis from a doctor for ourselves or for a loved one. We have, the cancer is back. We have, so many things that come up quickly. And sometimes we wonder too, and people wonder, well, where is God in all of this? Why isn't God doing something more in my pain and in my anguish and in my sorrow? But here we have a reminder that, Jesus knew what was going on. And he let the disciples battle some on their own. But when he came, it says they were terrified, and he called out and reassured them. It is I. Be not afraid. Don't worry. It's me. You know, it's Jesus, the one who loves you, the one who is your leader. And really, what consolation is that, just to hear, you know, it's me. But when Jesus gets in the boat, or well, first Peter says, command me to walk to you. And we know how well that works for Peter. He walks on top of the water a few steps, and then he realizes that he's human. He's out on the water. He doesn't float. He can't walk on water. He realizes his peril, and he begins to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. And, you know, we do that as well. Sometimes we wait for a while. Sometimes we try to deal with it on our own, but finally we'll cry out, Lord, save me. Lord, give me strength. And Jesus reached out and grabbed Peter's hand. He didn't make Peter come to him. Jesus reached out, it says, but when he noticed the wind, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. And then he said that, you know, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they all saw that, it says they worshiped him. Truly, you are the Son of God. This was another of the reminders, another of the real life stories that made them certain that they were following the Messiah. The last part of this boat, or this chapter, they had crossed over the sea and they came to a land of Gennesaret. And Gennesaret is on the northwest shores of Lake Galilee, and the Gadarenes, where the Gerasenes, the Ammoniac was on the southeast side. So they are separate lands. But Jesus comes to this, they come to this land of Gennesaret, and the people recognize him, and word spreads throughout the region about him, and they bring all their sick to him. And it says they begged that they might even just touch the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Another area where these people had heard of Jesus, had heard of his power, have heard of his willingness to help those in need. And I think that's another good lesson for us, is that Jesus is there for all of us in our times of need.